Hello friends, my name's the real Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Now in the past few weeks we've had some of the slower cars go around our track, so I figured I'd mix things up a bit and invite some Italian cars down to our track to see what they could do. So we're going to have some supercars around the track, yay! We start off with the Lamborghini Veneno, 740 horsepower, 3,218 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today, by quite a little bit to be honest with you. The Veneno, the reason it's here is because the Pagani Zonda Cinque has been sat at second place on our board for a rather long time, and I think it's time we finally give it some competition, hence the Veneno. So the Veneno in its favour has four-wheel drive and a bit more power than the Zonda, while as the Zonda, probably the nicer car to drive. Don't get me wrong though, the Veneno is a superb car to drive. To be honest with you, I would probably prefer the Veneno to the Zonda, but the Zonda was a bit lighter, so it felt a bit quicker on its feet. It could probably get around the corners a little bit faster than the Veneno could, but the Veneno is still an amazing handling car. It's basically a four-wheel drive supercar without the understeer, so it's just incredible. It's extremely fast, it's very, very good looking, it looks like the Batmobile for crying out loud, it's awesome. Yeah, so the Veneno was a very, very good car. Next up, another Lamborghini. We have the Lamborghini Gallardo LP 570-4, 562 horsepower, 3,470 pounds of weight. Now, we've had the Huracan around before, and that was basically the successor to this car, so I kind of wanted to see what the Gallardo could do and how it would compare to the other Lamborghinis and the other supercars. Of course, the Audi R8 is quite, well, it's actually basically a Lamborghini without a Lamborghini badge, and I don't know why you'd want that, but people do buy the Audi R8. But anyway, let's ignore that. How does the Gallardo drive? Well, there were some issues through Hammerhead, as you're about to see. I cock it up tremendously. I have no idea how that happened. It looked like I ripped the handbrake, but I really didn't. I don't know how that happened. But the Gallardo was actually a good handling car. Believe it or not, four-wheel drive supercars are pretty safe, to be honest with you. They don't really move around too much, they won't slide out. The Gallardo does understeer a little bit, as does, I believe, the Nissan GTR also has a similar sort of issue where it understeers quite a bit. Yeah, it was only really through Hammerhead and the second to last corner it was noticeable. Other than that, the Gallardo was a very, very good car to drive around here. Next up, Ferrari 430 Scuderia, 503 horsepower, 2,975 pounds of weight. Now, those are pretty supercar-like stats, basic supercar stats, 503 horsepower, relatively average, or at least it was back in 2007, and so is the weight. And the way this thing drives, well, it's very average supercar. That's the best way to describe it. It's mid-engine, rear-wheel drive. It's honestly, it's really kind of good. I drove this straight after the Gallardo, and this has got a lot less understeer than the Gallardo. However, you do have to be slightly more careful on the power. Because it's rear-wheel drive, this will actually slide out if you just stomp on the power constantly. But to be honest with you, it isn't that hard. It's a relatively easy vehicle to drive. Now, the 430 Scuderia is coming around here because I kind of wanted to see how this would compare to the 458 Italia, as well as just the other supercars. Back in Season 2, this was one of the first cars to go around, and it set a relatively mediocre lap time, and it got beaten by quite a lot of vehicles, so I wanted to see how the Scuderia would do, you know, a lot later on in this series. Obviously, now that I've had time to learn the track and what the cars do and so on. So yeah, that's why the Scuderia is around. We'll have to see what lap time that pulls at the end of the show. Next up, we've got the Ferrari 599 GTO, 661 horsepower, 3,538 pounds. You know it's a good show when this car hasn't got the most horsepower here. 661 is a hell of a lot. So we had the F12 Berlinetta round, actually relatively early on in this season. And I kind of wanted to see how this vehicle would compare to the F12 Berlinetta. To drive the 599 GTO is nowhere near as intimidating as you would expect. In Forza Motorsport 5, this car was somewhat hard to drive, but it felt tremendously fast. In this game, it doesn't feel as quick in a straight line, like it doesn't take your breath away, the acceleration, but then again, that's because I have been driving supercars around here. but it does feel actually quite nice to drive, which is really what you don't expect from a 661 horsepower car. It's good, you know, it is rear wheel drive, it will go sliding, granted, but it's actually pretty normal to drive. It just feels like a normal rear wheel drive coupe despite having 661 horsepower. Next up, we're going to start getting into some of the more interesting cars I've brought along today. This is the Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale, 245 horsepower, 1,543 pounds of weight. Now, we did have the Ferrari 250 LM around at some point, and that vehicle actually set a surprisingly good lap time, so I kind of wanted to see what the 33 Stradale would do. To drive this vehicle is interesting. I got out the 599 GTO and got straight into the 333 Stradale. And, well, the first thing you notice is the suspension is very, very soft. It was nowhere near as bad as I expected it to be. I expected this vehicle to just try to kill me constantly. As soon as I started braking into a corner, I noticed the front end was leaning. I was like, oh, okay, it's one of these cars. But to be honest with you, you do get used to it. It didn't really throw the car out all that much. This car has a red line of 10,000 RPM, which was a lot of fun. It shoots fire. It's actually pretty damn quick, and it handles really nicely as well. The 33 Stradale is actually pretty good. For 245 horsepower, it's the least powerful car here today. It weighs the least as well. It only weighs 1,543 pounds, which is not a lot. Yeah, that car was very, very surprising. Next up, we have the Lancer Delta S4, 247 horsepower, 2,646 pounds of weight. Now, when I tried to drive this thing back in Season 2 in Forza Motorsport 5, I had a very memorable off with this car. It tried to kill me, basically. It went on three wheels, and it basically skidded straight through the second to last corner, and I believe it may have even flipped. Now, the S4 in this game, I was sort of dreading this car, but to be honest with you, it's much improved. This suspension is nowhere near as wallowy as it was back in Forza Motorsport 5. Don't get me wrong, I had a scarier moment later on, which I will show to you. But the S4 didn't try to kill me. Well, it did try, but it didn't succeed. The cool thing with this car is it's twin-charged, which means it's got a supercharger and a turbocharger. That not only means that it sounds awesome, and is an awesome concept, but it also means actually getting this off the line compared to other turbocharged cars is actually pretty easy. You can just sort of stick your foot down in this and it will launch, unlike most turbocharged cars that would just sort of limp. Through there, it was a bit scary. You see it there, it did raise up onto three wheels a little bit. The front end did go very, very light. Luckily, it didn't do it around the second to last corner. That's where the version of Forza Motorsport 5 threw me off, because it was freewheeling through the second to last corner. But this one didn't even do that, so that was good. And finally today, something very interesting actually. This is the Maserati Ghibli S, 404 horsepower, 4,123 pounds of weight. Now, this is probably one of my favourite modern saloon cars. I think this thing looks fantastic, and I love the idea of a Maserati saloon. Interestingly, this car's four-wheel drive, which is something you don't really expect from Maserati. It is the heaviest car here today. It's also the third least powerful, which at 404 horsepower still means it's got quite a lot. I was kind of curious to see how this vehicle would compare. You know, we've had, say, the Audi RS4 Avant around here. We've also had the likes of your BMW M4s and your Lexus RCFs. I thought this was going to sort of bridge the gap between the sort of early 2000s saloon cars and the modern you know, sports coupes and sports saloon cars and so on and so forth. The Ghibli was a relatively nice car to drive. I do have to admit, after coming out of driving supercars all day, it did feel a little bit slow. It isn't, I can assure you that. It also feels quite understeery, probably the most understeery car here today. But saying that, it's still a pretty nice car to drive, to be honest with you. It was relatively non-descriptive to actually drive this car. It doesn't really have many characteristics other than understeer, but there you go. Anyways, the Lamborghini Veneno did manage to knock the Zonda off with a 110.758, putting it in second place, beating the Zonda by 0.6 of a second. That's pretty good. It beats a Lykan Hypersport and a Hennessy Venom by almost 2 seconds as well. That car was very quick. Moving on to, surprisingly, it's a group. The Lamborghini Gallardo goes into 23rd with a 116.037. The Ferrari 599 GTO goes into 24th, marginally missing out with a 116.054. And the 430 Scuderia goes into 25th with a 116.180. All of those cars beat the Berlinetta. All those cars beat a Ferrari 458 Italia. I wasn't expecting the 430 Scuderia to be that fast. I was kind of expecting the GTO to beat the F12, but not as much as it did, and the Gallardo did surprisingly well. Beating a 458 by 0.5 of a second is a pretty good achievement. The 33 Stradale also surprisingly goes into 37th with a 118.013, beating out an SLS AMG, Lamborghini Diablo, Shelby GT350R, a Mercedes AMG GTS, and modern Grand Tourer got beat by a 245 horsepower ancient race car. The Maserati Ghibli goes into 75th with a 123.429. Yeah, about what I expected. RS4 Avant, it's quicker than, but it is slower than a Lexus RCF and a BMW M4, so about where I expected it to be. And the Lancer Delta S4 goes into 82nd with a 124.757, beating an Evo 6 and a Subaru Impreza WRX STI, making it one of the fastest rally cars we've ever had round, save for the crazy Metro. That's a pretty respectable time. So all the cars here today have done pretty well, so congratulations to them. Next week we're going to be covering Ultimate Track Cars, and of course there's also the single Top Gear laps now. So feel free to go over to that episode that I did on Wednesday. It was the Lamborghini LM002. Feel free to vote in the straw poll as to what car you'd like to see next. But other than that, friends, that's it from me. Thank you all very much for watching. My name's been The Real Emile. Until next time, farewell.